The UK left the EU political structures and the European Parliament on January 31st in 2020. I talk a lot about this on my main channel. But the EU, of course, moved forward after the UK left with Brexit. But what happens in the EU today? And one of the topics I talk about in this video. Swift agreement on the Multiannual Financial Framework revision, as proposed by the Commission in June 23, is urgently needed in order to provide the necessary resources for crucial new needs, which cannot be financed under the MFF ceilings as they currently stand. This is particularly necessary to enable the EU to respond to the consequences of Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine on a stable footing, the continued migratory pressures and their root causes, EU response to natural disasters, and the global competition on key critical technologies. However, the European Parliament and the Council of the European Union have reached an agreement on the EU budget for 2024, which notably will help address the most urgent consequences of the crisis in the Middle East in the countries concerned, as well as in Europe and its neighborhood. The Commission welcomes this agreement, of course, which will ensure funding for the EU's priorities for next year. The agreement on the 2024 budget is for commitments of 189.4 billion euros and payments of 142.6 billion. The 24 budget will continue supporting the ongoing economic recovery while strengthening Europe's strategic autonomy. Green and digital spending will continue to be prioritized to make Europe more resilient and fit for the future, including through the so-called Next Generation EU. The budget agreed will direct funds to where they can make the greatest difference. To address the Union's priorities, it has been agreed to finance a few things, and I have them for you, with 16.2 billion to support the neighbors and international development and cooperation. The agreement includes targeted increases for the humanitarian aid program to address crisis situations across the globe, including pressing needs in the EU's neighborhood. The funding for the Neighborhood Development and International Cooperation Instrument, the NDICI, Global Europe, is 11.5 billion and focuses on, for instance, on migration in the southern neighborhood, on root causes of migration in Africa and elsewhere, as well as on funds to Moldova to carry out the necessary reforms on its enlargement path to the EU. And 2.1 billion will be available for the instrument for pre-accession assistance to support, for example, reforms in the Western Balkans. 53.7 billion for the Common Agricultural Policy and 1.1 billion for the European Maritime Fisheries and Agricultural Fund for Europe's farmers and fishers, but also to strengthen the resilience of the agri-food and fisheries sectors and to provide the necessary scope for crisis management. There will be 47.9 billion for regional development and cohesion to support economic, social and territorial cohesion, as well as infrastructure supporting the green transition and union priority projects. There's 13.6 billion for research and innovation, of which 12.9 billion for Horizon Europe, the Union's flagship research program. The budget also includes the financing of the European Chips Act under Horizon Europe and the Digital Europe program. There are 4.6 billion for European strategic investments, of which 2.7 billion for the Connecting Europe facility to improve cross-border infrastructure. 1.3 billion for the Digital Europe program to shape the Union's digital infrastructure, and 348 million for InvestEU for key priorities. That's research and innovation, twin green and digital transition, the health sector, and strategic technologies. There will be 2.3 billion for spending dedicated to space, mainly for the European Space Program, which will bring together the Union's actions in the strategic field. There will be 21.9 billion for people, social cohesion and values, 16.8 billion for the European Social Fund, that's the ESF+, 3.8 billion for Erasmus+ to create education and mobility opportunities for people. There will be 335 million to support artists and creators around Europe, and 261 million to promote justice, rights and values. There will be 3.3 billion for the rising borrowing costs for Next Generation EU, 2.4 billion for environment and climate action, of which 765 million for the LIFE program to support climate change mitigation and adaptation, and 1.5 billion for the Just Transition Fund to make sure that the green transition works for all. There are 2.2 billion for protecting the borders, of which 1.2 billion for the Integrated Border Management Fund and 859 million for the European Border and Coast Guard Agency, that's Frontex. There's 1.7 billion for migration-related spending, of which 1.5 billion to support migrants and asylum seekers in line with the values and priorities. There's 1.6 billion to address defense challenges, of which 638 million to support capability development and research under the European Defence Fund, that's the EDF. There are 251 million to support military mobility, 260 million for the new short-term defense instrument EDIRPA, and 343 million to support the production of ammunition. 958 million to ensure the functioning of the single market, including 602 million for the single market program, and 200 million euros for work on anti-fraud, taxation and customs. There are 754 million for EU for Health to ensure a comprehensive health response to people's needs, as well as 240 million to the Union Civil Protection Mechanism, that's RESC-EU, to be able to deploy operational assistance quickly in case of a crisis. There are 733 million for security, of which 322 million for the Internal Security Fund, which will combat terrorism, radicalization, anti-Semitism, organized crime and cybercrime. The annual budget for 24 will now be formally adopted by the Council of the European Union and, of course, by the European Parliament. The vote in plenary, which will mark the end of the process, is currently scheduled for November 22nd. And if you want to know something else, the next video is right here in the end screen. I'll see you there. I'll be back.